I'm just going to go briefly into what has happened recently. Then I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the background that led up to this, and then I'm going to go into what's been happening in Nigeria as a whole over the last few years, and then broaden it out into the whole of Africa and what imperialism is doing in Africa. So more than 300 young women were actually kidnapped by this Islamist sect called Boko Haram on the 14th, or is it the 15th of April, from their school in the town of Chibok in Borno State in Nigeria's northeast, which is actually the birthplace of the Boko Haram insurgency. After almost 2 months, Boko Haram is still holding at least 223 of the girls, according to the Nigerian authorities. In reality, the numbers that were kidnapped might be more, might be less. This sort of doubt about how many were kidnapped, when they were kidnapped, is kind of typical of Nigeria and the statistics and the figures that come out of the country. This attack was only the latest in a long line of violent attacks that actually began in 2009, and which was directed specifically at the Nigerian state. Since Boko Haram's violent insurgency, thousands of people have actually been killed. The UN's estimated that 70% of the victims were women and children. There are 300,000 internally displaced in neighboring states, and thousands have actually fled to neighboring Niger and Cameroon. As you can see on the map, that's Nigeria there, and that is the Borno state in the northeast. And thousands of people have actually fled across the desert into Niger and into Cameroon, northern Cameroon and Chad. Nigeria is now actually facing its biggest crisis since the Civil War in 1967, and unresolved issues from that war are actually part of the deeper problems that are at the root of this crisis. The imperialist nations, Britain, France, the United States, especially Britain, are actually using this crisis as an opportunity to get boots on the ground as part of their long-term plans to recolonize Africa, as Lewis has just said. Let's go into a bit of the background and the history of what's been happening. In the 1980s, a disaffected anti-establishment group of unemployed youths and migrants, which were based in Kano State, which was sort of in the north of Nigeria. Based in Kano, it was led by a radical Muslim preacher called Mohammed Malwa, who was also known as Maitatsin. This movement was crushed by security forces. Maitatsin preached against the Islamic establishment in the north, as well as the government. Maitatsin himself was actually from northern Cameroon. He was actually from northern Cameroon. And don't forget, in colonial times, all this area, I mean, there was free movement between this area, all the people in these areas were basically the same, but these borders were artificially drawn by the imperialists, with Britain taking Nigeria and the French taking Cameroon, Niger, and so on. So Maitatsin was actually from northern Cameroon. Anyway, he was preaching in Kano against the Islamic establishment and against the government, against corruption. He was also preaching against things like radios and watches and cars and bicycles, or using more money than you actually needed. So it was like quite a radical fundamentalist ideology. He even preached against anybody using any other religious books apart from the Quran. And he even rejected the Prophet Muhammad, claiming that he was the Prophet. From there, his followers moved from from Kano, they moved to Kaduna and to Borno, so they moved to the northeast. After police massacres, which resulted in over 9,000 deaths over the next 5 years, between 1980 and 1985. So, the point I'm trying to make is that in that northeastern region, in fact, across the whole of the north of Nigeria, there actually exists popular conservative movements which advocate a return to the true practice of Islam, but not necessarily the creation of an Islamic state. After the Maitatsin uprising was crushed, in the 1990s, another radical preacher, this time called Mohammad Yusuf, appeared. He was also preaching against government corruption, which is very easy to do because the government there is very corrupt, as everyone knows. And he also preached against Western influences, including Western education and so on. Individuals who were sympathetic to Yusuf and his movement, which is called the Yusufiya movement, were actually invited into the state government by the Borno State officials. So Borno State is in that northeastern area. So people who were sympathetic to Yusuf were actually invited into the state government. Some of the state officials simply thought that Yusuf was overzealous and he just needed to calm down. Former president, late president of Nigeria, Yar'Adua, admitted in 2009 that the government has actually been monitoring and tracking the activities of the Yusufiya group for several years, and that they had been organizing and penetrating our society, procuring arms and learning how to make explosives and bombs. The government dismissed them as fringe radicals who would be wiped out easily. Yusuf and his family members were actually executed in July 2009. In fact, the way Yusuf died, his body riddled with bullets after being badly beaten and then shot in the head, was only a high-profile example of what is a frequent occurrence in Nigeria. And it was only after the extrajudicial killing of Yusuf in 2009 that this group actually started attacking civilians. So prior to that, they had mainly targeted security officials. Since then, Nigeria's police and military forces have launched a scorched earth campaign and committed massacre after massacre in their fight against Boko Haram. Young men in long flowing robes, which is the traditional Muslim garb in West Africa, are being shot on sight by security forces. Civilians have suffered indiscriminate bombings and shooting. There have been unexplained civilian deaths, nighttime roundups of young men, disappearances and torture by security forces. Detainees are beaten, starved, shot and even suffocated to death. Last year it was reported that more than 60 bodies a day were being brought by the Nigerian military to the state hospital in one city, in one state, i.e. in Maiduguri in Borno. And that was just one city. 60 bodies a day were just being dumped in the mortuary. So thousands have actually fled multiple villages in that area, fleeing for miles through the harsh and baking semi-desert, sometimes on foot, fleeing from Nigeria's biggest economy to Niger, which is one of the poorest countries on earth. Fleeing a climate of terror by Nigeria's government. In April last year, in Baga village in Borno State, soldiers actually doused thatched roofed homes with gasoline, setting them on fire, and then shot residents when they tried to flee, killing over 200 civilians. They even took a child from his mother and threw it back into the flames. This is terrorism, the terrorism that dare not speak its name. These very grave war crimes has been documented by the likes of Amnesty International and the New York Times, amongst others. Yet in 2014, Boko Haram are apparently an international terrorist group that necessitates the intervention of imperialist powers, and 5 battalions of Nigeria's 5 northern neighbours, who have all grouped together, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, Benin, all grouped together to form an international force to fight Boko Haram. Now, Nigerian state terrorism is obviously one factor that is fueling the Boko Haram insurgency. As you can imagine, the more they terrorize the people in that area, the more some people are going to be driven towards joining Boko Haram, especially as they continue to preach against the corrupt government and the government who is killing civilians. But that is only a small part of it. More significant is actually Boko Haram's political support. In the run-up to the general election in 2003, prominent Nigerian politicians, led by the former Borno State Governor Ali Modu Sheriff, another Senator Ali Ndume, and the late Nigerian ambassador to Sao Tome and Principe called Saidu Pinda, formed ECOMOG. Sao Tome and Principe, so there, an oil-rich island in the Gulf of Guinea. So the Nigerian ambassador to that country, along with these other senators and governors, formed a group called ECOMOG, 2003, which was an armed gang of political thugs who were set up to intimidate their political opponents and to rig elections and to keep their political party in power. Borno State actually has a budget of 204 billion naira in 2014, which is, if you convert it, 785 million pounds a year. So that's the budget of just that one state. So you can see what they're fighting over. So they formed this ECOMOG, which is so the millions of pounds, a massive reward for whoever wins the elections. So after the elections, ECOMOG members were abandoned to their fate. Their leader was assassinated, and promised payments did not materialize, which forced some of them to gravitate towards religious extremism and crime. The arms and the contacts of ECOMOG, combined with the remnants of the Yusufia group, led to the formation of Boko Haram. Just to say about Boko Haram, the Boko Haram never actually called themselves Boko Haram. You know, they called themselves Jamaat or something like that, but they were known locally as the Yusufia group. The name Boko Haram, which means Western education is forbidden, is actually a name given to them by politicians and so on. But they never called themselves that. Anyway, so the ECOMOG and the Yusufia group formed Boko Haram. So in addition to political patronage and sponsorship, there's also been collaboration by sections of the Nigerian army and Boko Haram. In last year, in 2013, the chief of the army staff, a guy called Lieutenant General Ihe Jirika, revealed that some soldiers have been interacting with Boko Haram and divulging vital military secrets such as troop movements, which enabled Boko Haram to mount surprise and successful ambushes. Many Boko Haram attacks actually see them wearing military uniforms and have sophisticated military weapons, which are obviously supplied by the army. And this year, on the 3rd of June, no fewer than 15 senior military officers, including 10 generals, were court-martialed and found guilty of giving information and ammunition to Boko Haram terrorists. So obviously we're not saying that the whole Nigerian army is behind Boko Haram, but there are obviously sections of the army that, especially in the north, that support them basically using them as a proxy. So that should rubbish any claims that CIA are behind Boko Haram, or the Zionists are behind Boko Haram, which is just nonsense. They're talking about the political establishment in Nigeria, as well as massive poverty and unemployment, which I'm going to go into now. According to the 2013 Human Development Index report, 68% of Nigerians live in poverty. And in 2010, live in poverty, i.e. they're earning below $1.25 a day. If you use that measure, 68% are below it. In 2010, UNESCO said that it was 92% were living below $2 a day. So even if you put your poverty level at $1.25, there's still a massive people above that who are still living in poverty on less than $2 a day. 92%. This was in 2010, and obviously since then poverty has only actually increased. Adult illiteracy rates for both sexes is 61.3%, and it is higher in the north, obviously, than in the south. Most poverty alleviation programs, which are worth billions of naira, are actually mere direct transfers of cash to politically selected beneficiaries. There are 15 million children who are doing hazardous work in mines, fisheries, and agriculture, or working as street vendors, scavengers, beggars, girls being forced into commercial sexual exploitation. Life expectancy is at 52 years, and health indicators reveal that only 1.9% of the nation's budget is actually spent on health. For instance, there are only 27,000 doctors in the country, a country of 170 million people. There are 300,000 pregnant women who contract HIV annually. And in 2009, the World Bank reported, so this is 5 years ago, that there were 40 million unemployed youth between the ages of 18 and 25. Most of them in the north of Nigeria, which is the poorest part of Nigeria, is in the north. In the north of Nigeria, in 2008, there was only 22% of girls went to school or were in school. So these massive people form a ready pool of cannon fodder that can be exploited by unscrupulous politicians for their selfish gains. High poverty and unemployment rates, poor access to basic services, and starvation make northern Nigeria fertile ground for Boko Haram or any other group that can easily tap into that widespread discontent with the political and economic status quo. So as Lewis was saying, the people of Africa, people of Nigeria are not passive victims. I mean, in response to the Chibok kidnappings, there have been almost daily street protests and demonstrations. Protests demanding the return of the girls and more government action. These protests have sprung up around Nigeria, something that Nigeria is not known for. Protests have also taken place throughout Africa and internationally. The Bring Back Our Girls hashtag on Twitter became a global rallying cry for the missing girls. And what is very positive is the way in which ordinary Nigerians from across the country have referred to them as our girls and claimed them as sisters, breaking down artificial barriers between Muslim and Christian and so on, which politicians and the media play up for their divide and rule purposes. So what's been the Nigerian government's response? The day after the kidnapping, Nigerian authorities claimed that the number of people abducted was just over 100 young women, and that most had already been rescued. The military was then forced to recant its statement after protests began and acknowledge that it had actually not rescued any of the girls, as we say in Nigeria, it was a pure lie. It took more than 2 weeks for President Goodluck Jonathan to meet with all of the stakeholders, including the security, the school and state officials. And it took more than 3 weeks for him to even comment on the kidnappings. The Jonathan government, including Mr. Jonathan himself, claimed on TV that the parents didn't give the police and the army details of their missing daughters, and that this was hampering efforts to rescue them, which is another pure lie. So they were blaming the victims. Nigeria's First Lady, Patience Jonathan, personally intervened against leaders of the protest movement, claiming the demonstrators should be arrested and will only have themselves to blame if anything happened to them. And recently, the police have placed a ban on all protests calling for freedom of the abducted Chibok schoolgirls in the capital, Abuja. The government have also actually set up another group, another protest group, under the hashtag Release Our Girls. And this is very interesting, because the Bring Back Our Girls, that phrase is obviously directed at the Nigerian government, saying, you bring back our girls. So the pressures on the Nigerian government to do something. Release Our Girls is now actually directed at Boko Haram, saying, no, you, Boko Haram, you release our girls. And the Release Our Girls campaign people have physically attacked the Bring Back Our Girls protesters. So in Abuja, where there are daily sit-ins, the Release Our Girls group, which is basically a renter mob of thugs, have come in by bus and physically attacked the women who are basically camped outside the government buildings. They're cooking there, they're sleeping there, they're camped there, they're protesting there. Attacked them, broken their chairs, broken their equipment, trying to intimidate them to stop protesting. The police have banned the protest. So you can see what the Nigerian government's response has been. Basically attacking this protest movement, which is focusing attention on them and the fact that they're doing nothing, or they haven't done anything to get these girls back. Yet by contrast, there have been zero prosecutions, against Boko Haram members in the last 4 years. The Nigerian military's response to Boko Haram has been the usual blunt approach of massacres, mass execution, floggings, and assassinations. The government's unwillingness or inability to respond to the kidnappings is actually due to them preparing to rig the 2015 elections, which is where their focus has been. The state governments around the country have already started arming local militias and vigilantes who actually have the recognition and support of the police in preparation for the elections next November. Former President Obasanjo alleged that a major called Hamza al-Mustafa, who's a former president's chief security officer, was released from prison to help train snipers to assassinate political opponents. So he's a former president, so it's not just some guy off the street saying this, so you have to take what he's saying seriously. So that's where their focus has been, the next election. Another factor explaining the sluggish reaction to the kidnapping is that the military has been reduced in size due to a long history of coups. Between 1966 and 1999, there were 10 military coups in Nigeria. There were 250,000 soldiers in the army in 1977, and that's been reduced to about 160,000 in 2010. So the civilian government is trying to reduce their ability to mount coups, which will basically remove them from power, and then they can start eating the money. Yet the military has become entrenched in all facets of Nigerian civic and economic life. They have a central role manipulating national political life, creating artificial political parties. They have a central role in the control and management of Nigeria's oil wealth. So a civilian government trying to wrench control from them is going to be very difficult, as we can see, as we've seen with what I've just said, the collaboration with Boko Haram by some generals. Okay, let me just focus on kidnapping for a few minutes. Since the kidnapping of the Chibok girls, there have been more kidnappings and more killings in Borno State itself, i.e. in the exact place where those girls were kidnapped. There have been more kidnappings since then. In fact, Nigeria is actually one of the worst countries in the world for kidnapping, which is actually a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Only last month, on the 4th of May, 3 Dutch nationals and 2 Holland-based Nigerians were kidnapped in the oil-producing Niger Delta, something the media must have forgot to report, the mainstream media. They were released 6 days later after ransoms were paid. The kidnapping of expatriates by armed gangs has been rife in the Delta region. The Delta region is down here in the south, where the major oil fields are. The 2009 WikiLeaks US Embassy cables revealed that most of the kidnappings was not done by Niger Deltans, but by individuals from outside the region. Something like 85% of the kidnappings was done by individuals from outside the region. So just like in the north, unscrupulous politicians exploiting mass poverty and youth unemployment created local militias and vigilantes to rig elections, and then which later morphed into armed groups when their patronage expired after the elections. Despite the Delta's incredible oil wealth, Despite the Delta's incredible oil wealth, the local population lives in abject poverty and squalor. They're excluded from the wealth, and they're actually drowning in oil pollution. So from about 1998, there have been protests against this exclusion and pollution in the Niger Delta. And the militia groups have tapped into this with the kidnapping of oil workers, robberies, and attacks on oil pipelines. And the Nigerian government's response to those protests and the wave of kidnapping was similar to their response to the radical Muslim movements in the north, which was a scorched earth policy and massacres. But it wasn't only Nigeria's security forces who were involved in oppressing this militancy. The oil companies, especially British oil company Shell, which pumps the majority of oil in Nigeria, they spent almost $400 million between 2007 and 2009 just to guard their installations, and they paid millions of dollars to the same militias who were attacking their facilities and kidnapping oil workers. Shell has maintained its own 1,200 strong internal police force. They've run a network of plainclothes informants and spies, been supplying government forces with gunboats, helicopters, vehicles, food, accommodation, satellite phones, and large-scale funding throughout the years of conflict in the Delta region. Other oil companies were also doing the same thing, and these Western imperialist oil companies and their governments were actually fueling a conflict in the region, which displaced and killed thousands. Over the past decade, the US and the EU have become increasingly focused on Africa, particularly the Sahel, which is here, the Sahel and the Sahara region. They've become focused in that area, using the pretext that it could become a safe haven for extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda. and they've used that pretext to increase their militarization of that area. The imperialists are seeing Al-Qaeda everywhere. They're seeing Al-Qaeda in the Gulf of Guinea, and they're seeing Al-Qaeda in the Horn of Africa. But there is serious doubts about the existence of any real armed Islamist movements in the Sahara that are linked to Al-Qaeda, besides those that have been fabricated by regional intelligence agencies, particularly Algeria's. The idea that Al-Qaeda will use, say, Mali as a base to attack Europe is just nonsense. It's palpable nonsense. The real goals are access to and control of Africa's massive oil and natural gas reserves and other strategic raw materials. The Gulf of Guinea alone supplies 13% of EU oil imports and 6% of natural gas. Africa already supplies 26% of US crude oil and petroleum products in 2010. Crude flows from West Africa to Asia, especially China, have risen by 40% in the last few years. There have been over 60 oil and gas discoveries in the last 6 years in East Africa, which has now established East Africa as one of the key emerging areas, the next epicenter for global natural gas, especially in Mozambique and Tanzania in particular, especially offshore here. Not to mention Somalia, Somalia and Kenya, where oil has recently been discovered as well, and Uganda, the whole area. So there is a scramble to get East Africa's oil and gas to the mainly Asian market, because that's easier. And in 2014, China agreed to invest $10 billion of oil exploration in the Bida Basin in Niger State. Niger State in Nigeria, not Niger the country. I'll come back to that in a second. And China has themselves deployed military forces to upgrade their ties with Nigeria's military and to help find the missing girls. But it is unfair to lump China in with the other imperialist predators, because while the Chinese capitalists are actually building infrastructure in Africa and transferring some technology, the imperialists are only interested in stealing strategic raw materials and securing the transportation routes, especially oil. So since 2002, the US has increased its military presence in Africa, maintaining what they call a small footprint. They have built military bases in several locations. And in 2013, the US sent 3,500 troops to 35 African nations, more than half the countries in Africa, again citing a growing threat from extremist groups. So there has been a gradual expansion of US drone bases in Africa. So they have a drone base in Niger now. They have a drone base in what's that country called? Burkina Faso. That's it. I was going to call it Ouagadougou. It used to be called Upper Volta. They have a drone base in Burkina Faso, in Niger. They have drone bases in Uganda, in the Seychelles, in Kenya. The ones in Kenya and Uganda are secret bases. So they have drone bases in that area. They're building bases in South Sudan, and they have a major base in Djibouti. And they are building more bases throughout. Just dig it out. Director, are you going to pause? Okay, thank you. I thought Spielberg here was going to pause the film. So they have military bases throughout Africa, which they're expanding, especially over the last few years. And unless you go looking for this information, you're not going to know about it because it's not reported. So Africa has become a key battleground in the fight to push out rivals like Russia and China, push them out or cripple their access to resources. In addition to the US, France also remains a major player in economic and military terms, with recent interventions in several African states. So in 2011, France bombed Libya, along with the British and the US, but it was mainly pushed by France and Britain. They bombed Libya. That same year they bombed Côte d'Ivoire, so implementing regime change in these two countries. In 2013, as has been mentioned before, they invaded Mali, which is there. There's a lot of uranium in Mali, a lot of uranium in Niger. Uranium is another strategic raw material. And this year, there are now over 2,000 French troops in the Central African Republic. In fact, France maintains thousands of troops in Burkina Faso, in Senegal, in Gabon, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Chad, and numerous other of their former colonies, so-called. France has actually recently overtaken Britain and the US with the most capital stock invested in Africa. So France is like the main investor in Africa. And there's a difference between capital stock and capital flows. So when you read in the media, you will always hear that China is the main investor in Africa, or China really trying to take over Africa. But what's happening with China is that their capital flows are higher. So let's say now France is given, say, £5 and the Chinese are given £10, right? So what the Chinese are given is higher, but the stock that has already been there over many years from France is a lot higher than what the Chinese have only just started. So what they've got invested already is very, very little. And obviously the country with the most capital stock has the most to lose. And that's why the French have, like I said, troops all over Africa, bases all over Africa, and all of that is never discussed. So they've overtaken Britain and the US with the most capital stock invested. And also, France has been trying to pull Nigeria away from Britain's influence. Now, Nigeria is actually surrounded by former French colonies, which will all speak French. Well, in 2012, well, maybe 2011, don't quote me, Nigeria actually joined Francophonie, which is a group of French-speaking African countries, right? You know, most Nigerians hearing that were just laughing, because they were saying we can't even speak English. How are we going to speak French? But you can see what's happening is that the French are trying to pull Nigeria into their sphere of influence. And it was actually France that called the security summits in February and May this year over Boko Haram. And they were the major player between pushing for this sort of 5 battalions from regional countries to patrol Nigeria's borders. All these countries, Benin, Niger, Mali, Chad, these are all neo-colonies of France, right? The French determine who rules these countries, and they're in total control. France's Total oil company is a prominent player in the global petroleum industry, with assets spread across more than 4 continents. It is a key operator in major oil markets, including in Nigeria, in Angola, the Middle East, Russia, and Norway. So France is also determined to defend its imperialist interests in Africa against the US, and the US is determined to maintain imperialist hegemony and keep at bay the EU, China, and other rising powers. So let me just talk about hypocrisy for a few minutes as well. Remember that Britain, France, and the US used Libyan jihadis to depose Gaddafi in 2011. And even as we speak, they are using Al-Qaeda-linked groups in imperialism's war against Syria. And don't forget that one of the most corrupt and reactionary regimes in the world is actually a major ally of Britain, the Saudi Arabian royal family. So the same people that use jihadists for regime change are now sending troops to Nigeria to fight against Boko Haram Islamic terrorists. I don't think so. Also, we also need to remember that Britain locks up thousands of Nigerian girls and women in immigration detention centers in this country. Last year, 2013, a Nigerian lady called Hassan Aliyu and her 3 children, 2 of those children are actually born in this country, were deported back to Nigeria. Hassan Aliyu fled what is called female genital cutting, and she didn't want her children to go through to be exposed to that. So she came here, she claimed asylum. She'd been living in Britain for about 10 years or something. You know, they've been here a long time. She had her 2 children here, claimed asylum, rejected, and then she was deported back to Nigeria. A lot of Nigerian women fleeing domestic violence, domestic abuse, trafficking, rape, are being locked up in immigration detention centers and deported. Yeah. In fact, I found out that there are about 40 Nigerians being deported every month on charter flights by the UK Border Agency, the Home Office, the British government. So these are the same people that are rushing to go and find the missing girls in Borno State. You know, of course not. So there's obviously an ulterior motive there. They don't care about these Nigerian women. In addition to that, something which also helps to explain what's going on, more oil has now actually been discovered. Traditionally, oil in Nigeria has been in the south, in the southeast, but more oil has now been discovered in the north. Like I said, China has invested 10 billion to prospect for oil in Niger state. Oil has actually been found in Lake Chad in Nigeria. There is oil wells have been discovered, and they're exploring for oil throughout the north of Nigeria, in Bauchi, in Borno State, and so on. So there's oil in Lake Chad, there are natural gas reserves in Bauchi. So it's not just in the Niger Delta. So during the Civil War, all the oil was in the Niger Delta, and the imperialists obviously wanted to keep Nigeria as one, and they felt that was the best way for them to control the whole country, whereas some of the northern elites wanted to split. But now that oil has been discovered in the north, you now have another material incentive for these northern politicians who are fueling the Boko Haram insurgency to actually split the country. But the imperialists don't want Nigeria to split. The imperialists, for now, still want Nigeria to stay as one, because that's easier for them to exploit the whole country. So there's this battle going on behind the scenes. So finally, this growing US and EU military engagement in Africa, usually under humanitarian cover, actually reflects the imperialist concerns about ensuring control of strategic resources in key resource-producing regions. Vice Admiral Muller, who was he was the man President George W. Bush entrusted with the U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, and in February 2008 he admitted, and I quote, "Protecting the free flow of natural resources from Africa to the global market is one of AFRICOM's guiding principles." And he specifically cited oil disruption, terrorism, and the growing influence of China as a major challenge to US interests in Africa. So there is an intensification of imperialist rivalry between the US and the EU. And the imperialists are battling for domination of a resource-rich continent. Not just oil, but other strategic raw materials. This is a very key phrase, strategic raw materials. You can go and Google it. So it's not just the oil, but the other strategic raw materials like coltan, uranium, diamonds, gold, and so on. And the imperialists are battling to dominate it and battling to overcome the growing involvement of China in Africa, which is a challenge to their interests. So these hypocrites have used the kidnapping as an opportunity to protect their imperialist interests. And we, wherever we are, but here in Britain, we must expose this and oppose these imperialist interests. Thank you very much.